A very warm welcome to the podcast of the World Wind Energy Association, the World of Wind Power. My name is Stefan Gsänger, and it's my pleasure that today I have a guest here with whom I can speak about a topic that is also beyond wind power. It's about a conference which took recently place in Colombia in Santa Marta that was about phasing out fossil fuels. Let's hear whether it's a groundbreaking event. Anyway, it's kind of first of its type that took place. And it's my pleasure today that I can welcome, similar name, Stephan Singer from the Climate Action Network. Stefan, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. People will mix up our names. I think they've done that in the past, but don't worry, we look different, we are different, and it's a pleasure to be your guest today.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. And before we start, so that people understand you a bit better, maybe you can explain your background. You are, I understand, although you are at the age that you don't need to work anymore, but you are still an advisor to the Climate Action Network. I know you have decades of history in climate change, environmental protection, and also renewable energy. Would you like to briefly introduce your what you've done over the last 20, 30,
Well,
maybe more years?
thank you, Stefan. I will do that one. As you mentioned, my age, 68 years old and now retired. Finally, I was working the last 12 years with Climate Action Network International. It's an umbrella network for about 2,500 civil society organizations worldwide in more than 130 countries, and we work on everything climate. Not we as a secretariat, but the network, our members, and our different nodes, as we call them, in the different regions in the world. Everything climate, not only energy, forestry, adaptation, resilience, finance building, capacity building, um, power building, as we call it, mobilizing people, grassroots, advocacy work, etc., etc. I've done this for the last 12 years. Before that one, I was quite a long time with the Worldwide Fund for Nature in Germany and in Europe and international as Director for International Policy. Before that one, I have a background in development aid. I was 5 years with GIZ in Germany, the German Development Aid Organization. I was working in India and Kenya, which was, I think, one of my biggest experiences in my life. I have done many things, and I grew up when I was young, innocent, still good looking, and had black hair and not a white beard. From the anti-nuclear movement in Germany, I was one of the first guys who were running against nuclear, and that made me also study physics and chemistry because I wanted to know how does it work. I was against nuclear because it was, if you come from the progressive movement, you are against these kind of different horrible things which are coming up naturally. But then I wanted to know exactly why am I against it. So I studied physics and chemistry, and I was only confirmed that this is all nonsense. So so when we talk about phasing out fossil fuels, we need also talk about phasing out nuclear and promoting 100% renewables, which is a big driver for my work.
That's a very good, almost a conclusion. But let's come to back to that. We are also let's mention that as well. We are working together as organizations also, World Wind Energy Association within the global 100% renewable energy platform with Climate Action Network, and it's a very fruitful way of collaboration. Not just you and me personally, but also the organizations. Now let's look at what happened in Santa Marta. I think it was now 2 weeks ago. We obviously, both organizations, both of us as well, we want to see a renewable energy world. Now, this conference was about phasing out fossil fuels. Could you explain a little bit the background? Who invited to that? I understand it was a governmental conference, and how significant was that conference?
Yeah, well, the routing of the conference is based in a process within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Climate Convention, which at the conference of the parties, when the governments are meeting back in Dubai in 2023, agreed in a voluntary agreement, but still it was a very important agreement that they said they want to transition away from fossil fuels. I want to double energy efficiency and triple renewable energy capacity by 2030 as an intermediate step. But this transitioning away from fossil fuels was not further defined, and it was taken up then by countries, in particular Brazil, but also Colombia from South America, for the conference of the parties, the climate convention last year in Belém. And they wanted to bring that up, and they brought this up in one way or the other. This was not very, I think, elegant how they did this. They did this in an ad hoc way, a little bit inorganized. But anyway, we had about 85 nations, governments who decided, yes, we want to have a kind of conclusion at this climate conference in Brazil last year to have a kind of pathway, a global roadmap on phasing out fossil fuels, eventually without telling or agreeing on the details, but let's develop a process. Now, 85 countries are not good enough for a UN agreement because you need at least a major majority for these kind of things, because these conferences or these agreements work with common consensus. One might not like this one, it's a different story, but that's the way it is. But then Colombia picked it up as a driver together with the government of the Netherlands. They needed a co-partner, they wanted a co-partner, and said, we invite you guys in March to Santa Marta in Colombia, and then let's talk about how we can develop a process for a global roadmap on phasing out fossil fuels. Only the willing are invited. So they didn't invite the OPEC countries, they didn't invite Russia, they didn't invite the US, and they didn't invite every country. They had about, in the end, I think 63 countries were there, mostly from developing world, many island states, many poorer developing countries, and European countries in particular were there. And they discussed this thing in a 4 days conference, which was quite participatory, quite inclusive, but didn't come to a final conclusion, which we all knew it would not happen at this point in time, because the idea was to basically embed principles. Together with civil society, this was quite inclusive, I must say. It was inclusive that civil society had been given lots of space for inputs, for consultations. So was the same with science. There was a science panel founded with more than 150 scientists, as far as I know, and they have working groups established, and they will work on the phasing out of fossil fuels and basically accompany and consult this process, but not, and unlike the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which many of you might know, which is also consulting and advising the governments on the state of the climate. But the downturn with the IPCC is that final conclusions have to be agreed with governments. This is different with the science panel. This decides independently and gives their conclusions. Now, whether governments take it or not is a different story. So that was, in principle, a good movement. I think there was a good mood as a start, and this is it's a process. It starts, and this is parallel, and not a replacement. It's parallel to the United Nations processes on Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, biodiversity. It's a separate process, but it's not a UN process. So they have the right to develop their own rules. They could go for majority rules, which I would recommend that we go for majority rules, because then we are not basically subject to be blackmailed by small blocking minorities. So we need to go, but this is a different story. It's a process thing. The next conference will be next year in Tuvalu, in a small island in the South Pacific. And I think it was a good start. Certain things were missing, I must say, and I'll come back to that one. But overall, it was a good start. The mood was good. We had very positive resonances and press releases by NGOs, by civil society in large, by indigenous peoples, by the trade unions, accepting and acknowledging that this was not the time to agree on a global roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels. It was rather great to have regional and national roadmaps to develop by the countries who are there, and then broaden the scope to other countries who are not there and try to get them on board.
Okay, so I do understand this process is somehow came out of the, if you want, traditional UNFCCC, the UN climate change process, which covers all countries now at this point in time, although the US have just withdrawn from some of the agreements. But I understand now they will also withdraw from the organization as such. But aside from that, all countries are there. But that requires anonymity. No? That's the requirement of the formal process. So this process started, but the goal, if I understand you well, is to really develop a roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels. I mean, we've been working a lot, you and me, and also the previous organizations that you work with, developing scenarios, for example, for a 100% renewable energy world. Was that, I mean, I know from your perspective, I know, but was that part of the discussion to talk about how a future world could look like?
Yeah, it was part of the discussion. It was not the primary subject of discussions, I must say. Because we were not in all discussions. Some were closed doors, some were open. Much was open. Much was also together with governments, I must say. Um, the understanding was, at least we as NGOs, civil society made very clear that we said a phase out is always a phase in. So you cannot have discussion about phasing out fossil fuels without having a good narrative how to phase in, because no government in the world, whether in the north, in the south, in the east, or the west, will agree on an aggressive phase out of fossil fuels without knowing what the alternatives could be and what the costs would be and where the options are lying. So it goes together, the two sides of the coin. And there were discussions about renewables in particular. It was a little bit weak on the other options, which we need as well, as we all know. Stefan, you and me, we know that one, and the expert know that one. It's not just about having targets and deploying renewables somewhere. It's about grid connectivity. It's about storage. It's about management of the flexibility, of the variability. It's about energy efficiency. It's about grids, etc., etc. That is a system which you need to deploy. I think the discussion was not that strong on that one, because we dealt mainly with governmental delegates, which were a little bit, I wouldn't say not up to date on everything, which is required in this technical ecosystem, which is also political in that context, right? I think that needs to be done, and I think it can be done. So I was in contact in particular with a couple of countries from the developing world, and we talked about, do we do this international roadmap, or do we do this all national? I said, listen, there's a hybrid. And I gave them the example of the European agreement on this North Sea wind agreement, which came out in couple of weeks ago, where the North Sea countries, North Atlantic countries, 10 countries, including non-EU countries like UK, Norway, and Iceland, but then 7 EU countries, agreed on having at least 100 gigawatt offshore wind developed in cooperation together until the mid-2030s, which I think is a cooperational regional plan, which other regions could do the same with solar, with geothermal, with wind, whatever they want. So it's not either or, but a global plan, and I know this from my experience. If the UN agrees on a global plan, no one is doing anything. Because everyone is saying, yeah, someone else is starting and we come later because, etc. We have other problems currently. We come later, we contribute. But no one takes responsibility. Having a national plan with good legislation, with making the national plan legally binding in the country, not in this process, but in the country is very important. And then you can have regional plans, if you wish to do so. So it's not either or. But starting from a global plan doesn't make sense. And I think everyone agreed on that one. And let's see how that works out. I do not know how that works out. But we have no alternative. We have an urgency in the climate situation. We have the highest CO2 emissions from fossil fuels ever in humankind's history. We have and rapidly growing global warming. We run into a super El Nino very likely this year, which will aggravate the global warming impacts, the climate change impacts. So we have no choice. There are so many other aspects which are so beneficial for renewables. Currently, in the current oil crisis we are facing, is the fossil fuel crisis we are facing in the Strait of Hormuz, where we see the vulnerability of fossil fuels is not acceptable. We talk about the the variability. We talk about the intermittency of renewables of solar and wind. No, I would say the intermittence is with fossil fuels,
That
unpredictable.
is a very,
And you
very
need to
good
have
point indeed. Yeah, yeah.
an alternative to that.
And I mean, we know, of course, that this crisis now, the current crisis, is affecting many countries very clearly. Just this morning, I heard the news that the Indian Prime Minister is calling on his compatriots to use less fossil fuel, to not use cars if possible, to not go by plane if it's avoidable. So I think many countries and many of our listeners will be personally affected. I hear from some colleagues that schools are doing distance learning like we did during the COVID situation. But going back to the conference, you said that there were like around 60 countries there. Civil society was there. That you said there were the so-called global south or so-called developing countries that was strongly represented. The United States not. Europe, I believe, was there. Maybe you can just explain that a bit. And you also mentioned that India, China, they were not there, but they were seen usually as playing an important role as drivers of this global transformation to renewable energy. How is your, I mean, first, can you just explain this again and how do you see this situation?
Yeah, let's start with India and China, the two most populous nations on Earth. They were not invited. No one knows why not. And I think there was a big mistake by the organizers, by Colombia and by the Netherlands. Brazil played a role also in the organization. They wanted to have a say there, and this is kind of Latin American national dynamics anyway. But it was a mistake to not invite India and China because not because they're just big or because they're large developing countries, um, but because they have done so much in the last years for renewable energy development. Um, China has a higher share of wind and solar than the global average and the OECD average as well. China has the highest share of sales and development of electric cars. China has a big move to electrify what we need, electrification towards 100% renewables eventually we want to go into, um, in schemes of transport, in schemes of heating increasingly. Yes, China is also the largest coal producer and the largest coal burner in the world. Well, they have 1.4 billion people, um, and not everything is perfect, right? But in comparison to many other nations who were there, China is admitting that they are not there yet to agree on 100% renewables. They're not there yet. Many other countries who were there were also not agreeing on 100% renewables. So why do we try to charge or to challenge China with that request, while some of the participants also not have the target and have not done as much as China has done for this big country? The same is true with India, which is even 5 times poorer on a per capita basis than China. Growth in India is, we have seen tripling wind growth, for instance, in the last 3 years in India.
It was the second
Solar,
largest market last year. They were behind
yeah,
China. Of course, there's still a big gap, but after China, India was the largest wind market worldwide.
yeah, they were tripling
Hmm?
within 3 years. They have the wind power capacity, onshore wind, right? They are 15% solar and wind, growing from almost nothing 10 years ago. Um, That all contributed to the global growth significantly, which we have seen with solar and wind in 2025 compared to 2024. To not invite those countries which have so much experience in poorer countries to develop these resources economically, socially acceptable, and and grid connecting it, we should also not forget that we had many that India and China were the countries in the world which were the first to comply with the Sustainable Development Goals to overcome energy poverty, electricity poverty in particular, in the global south. Right? Not saying that everything is perfect. Not they don't have China more than India, um, but in principle, they're all connected now with the grid or have their own mini grids in the villages and have potentially 24/7, not always, but potentially 24/7 electricity, which was a big no-no about 10, 15 years ago. I remember this when I was working in India, there was more than half of the population not electrified, right? And these are nations with more than 1 billion people. You can imagine the efforts which have been taken to not invite India and China was a big mistake. And let me tell this one: if you put them in the same boat as the US and Saudi Arabia by not inviting them neither, which I think is right, then to give a wrong message to the world, you give a really wrong message. And I think if you're not invited, very humanly speaking, if you're invited, you want to be invited to a party of friends, you know them for a long time, you want to share their experiences, and you have something nice to say, and then these guys don't invite you, then it's not your party anymore. Then you hate this party, right?
What
That's
about Europe? How was Europe represented there?
Europe.
Europe is
Europe
always
was
seen
represented.
as a
Yeah, I
key.
mean, let's talk. Let's start with Germany. It was interesting to see that the German minister didn't show up. The state secretary was there, Flassbart, and others, but they were not represented on the highest level, which I think should have been, unfortunately. Sorry. We had a couple of European countries there. We had the Scandinavian countries there. We had France there. France was very vocal on issues. France was supporting, but in a little bit of a loose way. It was not clear. Is it a proposal? Is it an idea which should be discussed? But this was the entire conference in that thing that they didn't follow strict forms. France was saying we should phase out coal by 2030, gas by 2040, and oil by 2050. Now, France. There's a story behind, there's a narrative behind, and there's a hidden agenda, which is nuclear, right? Because it's about phasing out fossil fuels. And of course, some people think it's 100% renewables, like I do, like we do, like you do, Stefan. Other think, oh, nuclear plays a role. Even some sort about some countries. I wasn't there. I heard we're looking into, yeah, well, I think as a kind of intermediate interim solution, we should look into CCS, carbon capture and storage,
Oh.
interim solution before we phase out fossil fuels, later, but we cannot throw that out. So these kind of discussions were emerging, appearing behind the scenes, but they were not dominant. Let's be honest, they were not dominant. They might become dominant in the future. I don't know. I hope they don't. That we focus really on the solutions. There were not much talk about energy efficiency, unfortunately, which I would have wished. We shouldn't forget that energy efficiency is about 1/3 to 40% of the solution to basically decarbonize. There's no single scenario that shows us to go to 100% renewables by mid-century, as we promote, without significant increase of energy efficiency, demand-side management, in all economic sectors. I think that's important to keep in mind that renewables alone, without looking into demand-side efficiency, wouldn't solve this problem.
I think this comes also automatically when you go for
I mean,
electrification. You have this automatic increase of efficiency with factor 3 or 4. No? So having a clear strategy and a vision. But I understand that this process is now not as yet as we want it to be. Actually, I remember, of course, I think that was the time when the first time we worked together, kind of 2004, when there was the Bonn Renewables 2004 conference, the first really international conference, governmental conference, to which the German government had invited with more than 100 countries.
Even Chancellor Schröder, huh?
Yes, at that time, coming on ministerial level. That took place here in Bonn, where we are now located. And there is here, of course, some reason why, because there's UN Climate Secretary, etc. So we do not yet have, and this conference, as I understand, it's not yet clear enough of setting up a pathway only for renewables. So there was other discussion as well. But I understand that you are slightly confident that the renewables discussion would be the dominating discussion in the ongoing process.
I just hope that. I hope that the let's say the clean energy ecosystem, right? I mean clean energy, sustainable energy. I exclude nuclear here. It's just like
Yeah, yeah.
renewables
No, I think we are
from a supply
on
side,
that
right?
side.
The other
We are very
components
clear
play a
that
role,
we.
as we all know. So I think there might be a consensus emerging. We have seen a desert in the UNFCCC and the Climate Convention over the last years, or let's say since the UNFCCC existed, since 1992, um, to focus on the key problem, the key challenge of the climate problem, which is fossil fuels. There are other problems as well with deforestation and so on and so on, but the key thing is the threat of fossil fuels.
Mm,
It was always avoided. They never talked about it. They never talked about the solution.
that's
This
true.
is diplomatic back and forth, and I think there was a common agreement, unfortunately, in the UNFCCC that they agreed on: don't touch the rules of the world, don't touch the national sovereignty, don't rule into what countries are doing with their energy supply. Let's tinker at the edges, basically changing deck chairs on the Titanic, right? This is my interpretation of the UNFCCC so far. Unfortunately, though the UNFCCC had a couple of bright moments in the meantime, like the Paris Agreement, like the Kyoto Agreement, but those were exceptions. Practically, nations kept on doing what they wanted to do, which is in their economic interests, and their economic interests are fueled by the incumbent interests, which are very often the fossil fuel and, if you wish, the nuclear interests. And they kept on doing business as usual. A little bit cosmetic changes here and there, some did better than others, but the real big changes, which are required from climate science to overcome the climate crisis, had not happened in no country.
I was shocked, frankly speaking. My first UN climate change conference, one of those COPs, I don't recall the number. I think it was 2006 or 5 in Montreal. You may remember the exact year. When I attended that the first time, there was not a single time I heard the word renewable energy, and I thought, okay, that is why I'm here, because this is the key solution, and we don't talk about it. We've come some way, I believe. So renewables are now, whenever you are at the COPs, there's at least some discussions about that. And of course, we've always hoped there would be more focus on the international level. What I hear from you is that still not really so clear. Irina, we were really able, and I can proudly say our organization, we really pushed very hard at that time already, because we saw this gap and thought that the International Renewable Energy Agency is a requirement to have more discussion on the global level. Now, coming back to Santa Marta, the International Renewable Energy Agency was there, I understand from you. How relevant did they play? Oh, they could exactly provide this technical know-how, because they have now great experts being based in Abu Dhabi, but also here in Bonn, which are doing scenarios. Did they play a kind of active role, or were they just more like observers in this conference?
Yeah, both. I mean, there were different components. There were the plenaries, and there were the high-level segments.
Mm-hmm.
And the boss of Arena, Senor La Camera, he was in speaking in the high-level segment.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking in a high-level segment doesn't mean that you have influence. You're listened to, media is listening to you, CSO are listening, and governments, I hope, are listening to as well. But real influence happens behind the scenes, as you said, Stefan. Development of scenarios which are tailor-made. You work with countries individually, and you make sure that it's not just a study, right? We have seen so many studies. Studies will be published, hardly anyone reads it, only the nerds like you and me do it. But otherwise, it takes dust on the shelf, like the books behind me, right? And that is not helpful. You need to have, before you start a study, And if you do the study properly, if you're convinced it's going to be properly by good scientists, by good researchers, well informed by the facts, then you say to your own constituency, okay, we do the study and we come with political recommendations how to implement the findings. So we make that legally binding in one way or the other, in a law, in legislation, in a regulation, whatever this is. But just doing the study, doing a big press conference, and then, after 1 year it's forgotten, it's not a way forward. Doesn't help. So I'm very much now to say I'm interested in legislation and regulation. We have so much studies. We know what's going on. Generally, we have enough. We have enough material to legislate, to regulate sufficiently. Of course, we're learning while we're working. We learn more that can be amended and added later on. But I want the real actions by legislation and not by commitments, by high level talks, blah blah blah, and people forget it. No, it has these consequences. You open your mouth, you have to whistle, right? And you have to implement. That's a point. That's a real point.
Now let's talk about what the impact is of this. I mean, it's nice to have conferences. Both of us, we go regularly to conferences, and some of them they have some impact, others not so much. Probably we've both been to Paris. That was a conference which has obviously an impact, whether it's positive or negative. We will, I think, not. You and we will find out, but maybe in 50 years you will know what really the ultimate outcome was. But as this is a more focused conference, let's look at the outcomes now. I understand there was no formal outcome in the sense there's, of course, nothing binding. But at first it was a meeting of the like-minded countries, although not all of them were, I understand from you as well. Now, what's the actual outcome? You mentioned a conference in Tuvalu, which I do understand will be officially co-hosted by Ireland as a European
Yeah,
country as well.
Ireland. Yeah,
But
yeah.
is there some hope that the process will lead to something, although we are not yet I mean, on the non-governmental side, we, for example, as a Global 100% platform, we have people working together and trying to promote this. Of course, not with the same impact that governments could do. Will there be are you confident that there will be a process on the governmental side that really those who are willing to act more than others, that something comes out of this process? That will then be probably still called Santa Marta process, but then next meeting taking place in Tuvalu.
I I'm more confident that this process might deliver more on phasing out fossil fuels. What is the target? Than the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, at this point in time. I'm confident that if that is done well, this Santa Marta process, or we want to call it, might have an impact and should have an impact on the UNFCCC, on the Climate Convention, but also on the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are finishing in 2030. I think I think I think we would have less chances to get something done on the UN level if we wouldn't have that process. So I think sounds conservative as I'm going into that one, a little bit defensive, but I'm careful here, right? I believe we have the chance now. This is a new process, an innovative process, an infant process, to start with our inputs, different CSOs, where they come from, not just environmental NGOs, as social NGOs, as trade unions, as face groups, it's human rights groups, is environmental defenders, it's grassroots groups, it's people who work on advocacy, scientific groups. I think we have now an opening door to directly fit into this process for the next conference and in between. Because in the end, everything which is being discussed and decided in Tuvalu then will be discussed beforehand and in between. The process and the dynamics for discussion will be shaped. This is not just happening out of the blue in the next conference. We know that from experience. Most of the work is happening before these kind of conferences. And if you don't succeed with the work before the conferences, you won't succeed at the conferences in the last minute. It doesn't work. You need to have your ducks in a row before. And I think the chances we're having now. And I think, again, let's work with China and India. Let's get them on board. And let's have a strong coalition of the willing, 400% renewables, as you said. Um, and I think then the point is, some would say India and China don't want 100% renewables by 2050. Yeah, but there are also other governments. The Europeans also don't have a 100% renewables position for 2050. So, but they are invited. What is this? Somehow this is inconsequential.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I mean it's not
We even don't
the
have a 2040 target for renewables and energy efficiency in the European Union. We have 2030 targets. Fair enough, but not for 2040. We have a vague target of being net zero by 2050 in Europe. But what it means in terms of implementation for 2050, no detailed targets. I would wish as the next step we would need 2040 renewable targets. But with 2030 is basically tomorrow. With the current targets run out. We need to do it now. Because you need time. You need planning time, you need implementation time, you need financing time for getting the high share of renewables in the European economy implemented. We have already significantly high shares, but even not good enough yet, right? We are not there yet. We're just halfway where we need to be. So you need time for that one. You need planning time. You don't start in 2028 and in 2038 to have targets for 2040. That doesn't work. So it's not just a Chinese and India thing. It's also a European thing. I even don't talk about the US, right, or Canada or Japan, right, which were also there. So I think let's get China, India there, please. And I made this case also with a couple of media, and they picked this up, and I like that. And I've talked to some Indian colleagues and Chinese colleagues, um, and they were also a little bit surprised and disappointed that their governments were not invited because they think these people don't understand what in these countries is happening. Um, I agree on that one. Not that I support everything was happening in those parts, but they both have problems. Also with coal in particular, or with nuclear, right? But on renewables, they show the way for the developing world and
but I
also for
think
many northern countries.
that's the core part of it, that renewables, and I think we had this as a kind of theme of our Global 100% platform, make it the new normal, so that you whatever you do, it's normal, and that is just happening now. China is exporting the solar panels. I think I'm sure that in many African villages now people just think of that's the option that we have. That's normal now. We think of that, and
And
so
China and India have reduced their coal consumption and their CO2 emissions for
that
the first
that
time in the
that is
last
well,
year.
yeah, yeah.
It
So
has an impact already.
we have a strong, of course, collaboration with our Chinese colleagues, and I see what's happening there on the ground with India. Similar. What just I wanted to at the end of, and time is running. It's very interesting, of course, and we could continue for a long time and talk about many aspects how to do it. Um, isn't it then even more important than actually what's happening on the ground? You've already mentioned some countries. We know that it's extremely important what China, India, what the European Union is doing. At the end of the day, it's also very important what people in the villages in Germany, Belgium, in Mali, in China are doing. And maybe this conference, we shouldn't overload it maybe with our expectations, but just see, okay, that can become an interesting meeting place for exchange our success stories, what our people are doing successfully not only for the climate, but also economically. We
Yeah.
exchange this, and then it's easier instead of this bottom up. We have, as you rightly said, we have a plan now. That's not a good idea. Start with a global plan, which we cannot achieve to some degree. Rather come with these success stories and make that out of that then a functioning, growing process. Would that be something that you think? Yeah, that's how
That's,
it could
that's,
work.
that's definitely that's definitely part of the solution that we provide success stories, but we should not limit it to success stories. We should also provide stories where things did not work. We should be honest to ourselves. We should be honest to
Very
others and
clear.
say,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
folks, certain things didn't work. Let's avoid this. Look into this one carefully. Be careful because it didn't work in our countries.
That's
Not
true. Yeah.
everything works everywhere, right? On top of that one.
Now, I don't want to only be positive, but just of course,
No, no,
then
no. It
the
was not about being negative. It was
failed.
about
That's
just let's
no,
let,
no, no,
let's
no.
have a
You're
rational, let's have a rational, a facts-based, and economic,
absolutely,
socially responsible approach to these
absolutely,
issues, right?
absolutely.
That we have to be flexible. We have to accept that different cultures, different societies, different circumstances, different economies and different. What works in China doesn't work in Chile. What works in Finland, it doesn't work in Fiji, etc., etc. And I think that's clear, and that's okay, and that's the way it is. No, I would say if you have a national plan, if countries could agree to have and would agree bindingly nationally, not in this process, because this process is deemed to be non-binding. It's voluntary, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. That they would say the next time for the next COP or the next whatever after Tuvalu, we present the components and elements of our national phasing out fossil fuel plan. We present this internationally and we make it legally binding in our country with participation of the people, with inclusiveness of the various civil society organization, consultation with business and industry, with the finance sector, with the trade union, in context also of a just transition, because that's important, the just transition as well. We think very often about countries that are using fossil fuels and they have a burden, and it's true, it's easier to get rid of fossil fuels if you have to buy them from abroad rather than you're an exporting fossil fuel company and your economy is highly embedded in fossil fuels as a producer. Um, I think these are some of the key problems we will have in the future. That for them, we need a diversification strategy, or they need to have it, an economic diversification strategy to adjust the jobs which will be lost, either
But this
losses of the jobs in the
also has
fossil
the
fuel
other
industry.
side where we work on. It's not just this helping those who lose their jobs or their businesses, which is also important, but also that's why, for example, we work a lot on community engagement.
Yeah,
Make sure that what you phase in is done in a way that shares the benefits better than the old system has done it.
yeah,
And I think we have an obvious advantage. Renewables are closer to the people. It's easier to achieve that. But I'm sure we are on the same side here
yeah.
that the phasing in also must consider this social participatory and fairness process
Yeah.
and aspects as well.
That's it. I mean, more we cannot expect, rather than a kind of, I would say, an agreement that I would wish my position or my opinion might change over time and I see other things, but this is what I would wish comes out of Tuvalu of this process, that every country who is invited and contributes comes out with a clear plan, where we want to be in 10, 15 years. What is our national plan for implementation of clean energy, phasing out fossil fuels and nuclear, if you wish, as well. Um, I think that would be, and that would also, and India and China, again, they can easily do that one. I just went through the Indian power sector plan for 2040. They have that already in place for 2040, right? This is much more detailed and much more better on renewables than the NDCs and the climate plan. The climate plan is just like something for the international audience, but what they do domestically, that counts.
Very
And the
good.
same was the
Yes.
five-year plan from the or the 10-year plan from the Chinese, and the five-year plan, 10-year plan, and so on and so on. They have that in place already. Countries can learn from that one. They're further than we are in Europe, right? Everything is limited to 2030. After that one, desert.
Stefan, thank you very much. I think this was very insightful for those many people who were not able to go to Santa Marta or they just heard afterwards about it. That was very important to get a better understanding. Your perspective, of course, nobody fully understands yet what the impact will be. We have a bit better understanding. Thanks so much for sharing it. Personally, for you, I wish you all the best for the work that you're doing. I know that it's a lot in line with the goals that we have. And then thank you for your time. And I would then say thank you to our audience for listening.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Stefan.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.